Hello and welcome to Issues in Policing, Topic 7, Lecture 2. Okay, so this week you're going to be listening to a really cool podcast and applying what you've learned from Chapter 7 and from these lectures to that podcast. So the podcast that you're going to be listening to is from a show called This American Life from National Public Radio, and the podcast is called Cops See It Differently. And it's a podcast that is it's an hour-long examination of the Milwaukee Police Department and some of the challenges that the Milwaukee Police Department is facing. And so it looks inside the Milwaukee Police Department, and it really brings to life many of the concepts that you're going to be learning about in these lectures and in Chapter 7. And so when you are listening to the podcast, keep Chapter 7 concepts in mind. And then when you will be participating in the discussion for this week, you will be asked to make some connections between that podcast, because that's the discussion is about the podcast and what you're going to be learning about in this chapter. So Chapter 7 talks about a lot of different things and focuses on a few concepts as it relates to policing. And so in this lecture, we're going to be taking a look at a few of those concepts. We're going to be looking at the concept of police culture, police styles, and the use of discretion by the police. There are other concepts that are developed in the chapter. So you're responsible for learning about all of these concepts, and you'll be applying these concepts in future work. In particular, there will be a question about the police concepts, these concepts on our final exam. So keep that in mind. But these are the ones that we're going to focus on in this lecture. Okay, so let's start with police culture. So people who research and study the police, they've found that there's an experience of being a police officer oftentimes results in the formation of like a subculture, a so-called police culture. And this is oftentimes referred to as the blue curtain. Your textbook talks about that. And basically what the blue curtain is it's like a culture of policing. It's the idea that the blue curtain is this secretive, insulated police culture that isolates officers from the rest of society, right? And so in a way, like, when we think about being a soldier, it's sort of like, a culture that forms around like the band of brothers, that culture, the culture, there's lots of different kinds of work cultures. But the police culture, the blue curtain, is really sort of seen as this set of values that binds law enforcement together in order to handle a very difficult job. And so the blue curtain or police culture forms because policing is a difficult and dangerous job. And so that there's a sense that when you're involved in policing, that it's only other police officers that you work with day in and day out that can really understand the job that you're doing. That you might feel disconnected. Police officers might feel disconnected from others that aren't in policing because they really don't truly understand the stresses and the challenges that police officers face. And so they find, sort of like a sense of unity and a sense of comfort and camaraderie in creating this police culture because it helps them manage the dangers of their job. There's this sense that you need to bond with other cops to deal with these difficulties of policing. And that when you have a culture like this, that it can help new recruits sort of deal with the challenges of the job because there's a culture that they've become a part of. It can help seasoned officers deal with the ongoing stresses and challenges of the job. And also that, there's like people might join the police force because they think that there's like this idealized like helping people aspect of policing. But sometimes policing doesn't really work out that way. That it can, you see a lot of dark sides of society and you see people at their worst. And so these kinds of police cultures allow police to manage and those stressors and allow them to do their jobs. Well, like any culture, police culture has shared values that make up and identify the culture itself. And so what are some of those shared values that make up police culture. Well, one is a belief that, cops in the police culture sort of believe that if you're going to truly effectively fight crime, that you really can't do it without breaking the law, and maybe not breaking the law, but bending the law, right? So that if you really want to fight crime, well, you might need to engage in some search practices that are not fully legal. Also, there might be this sense that you can get away with it if you're a cop, because who's the judge going to believe, or a juror going to believe, the criminal or the cop, right? So part of the culture is this idea that to fight crime, you kind of don't always have to follow the rules. That the police culture also, supports the value that cops have to act instantaneously. They're oftentimes presented with these dangerous situations that they need to react to quickly. And so it's like the value is placed on being able to act quickly and decisively. Even though those actions may be later criticized, it's okay. Don't wait and think and do a cost-benefit analysis. Cops need to act quickly, and if they get criticized for it, so be it. The culture, the police culture, and is your textbook talks about how police often see what they do as sort of like this clear line between the good and the bad, right? Likely to see criminals not as or lawbreakers not as these complex people who have a lot of issues and problems that lead them to engaging in criminal action, but rather see them as wrongdoers, as predators, as dangerous evildoers, and that cops are battling. They're the warriors who are protecting and fighting for the good. And then probably most importantly, I've buried the lead here, is that the blue curtain is the hallmark of the blue curtain is that the cops have loyalty to cops above all else. And so it is a tight-knit group of people who have each other's back, and that you are loyal to other cops at all, almost at all costs. Okay. And so those are some of the values that make up this police culture. Well, as there is with everything, there are upsides and downsides to forming a culture, including a police culture. So, you can think about this in more detail, and questions like this will come up on the final exam. But, what are some of the benefits and drawbacks of the police culture? And again, you're going to hear these benefits and detriments of this police culture of the blue curtain play themselves out really like profoundly, I think, in the podcast that you'll be listening to. And so, one of the benefits is of like any culture is it provides support, right? And so, as I mentioned before, it provides support for new recruits, gives people a sense of identity. And oftentimes you need a sense of identity to do any job, but in particular, a tough job, that gives you a sense of worth and value, because police officers tell themselves that even through all this hard work that you're doing and this dangerous work, that you are on the side of the right side, right? That you're doing good because you're fighting evil. And also it provides support for decisiveness, and law enforcement do need to make decisive, quick actions. Obviously, there are downsides to this as well. And so, as we're thinking about efforts in the United States to reform police culture, and you're going to see this play itself out in the podcast, that when you have a tight-knit culture that has certain values, it's oftentimes hard to deviate from those values. And sometimes you need to deviate from values to make change. And sometimes you need to make change in order to make policing more just, okay? And so, the police culture, makes reforms more difficult, particularly if you're like, this is how we've always done it. These are our values. We don't want to deviate from those values. When you bring in new reforms, they may not be taken seriously because it might rub up against the culture, the values of that culture. And also, if the part of the value is that, you need to kind of bend the law or sometimes break the law in order to do effective policing, that coupled with this loyalty above all else to other police, it could encourage and actually encourage illegal behavior or unprofessional behavior. It also might give you a sense that you're not going to get in trouble for it because other cops aren't going to turn on you. They are going to support you. They're not going to report you to higher officers and to report that negative behavior. So there are other things your textbook talks about, so make sure that you do sort of a full critical thinking about the pros and cons of the police culture. Okay, so the next concept we're going to talk about is police styles. Just like any other job that people have, that there will be certain styles or approaches or sort of philosophies that a person can, take as they are doing their job. And police, as we learned about earlier in the chapter, and as you're going to be learning about in these chapters, they engage in a diversity of tasks, right? As we know, police, they're the gatekeeper to the criminal justice system, that they are involved in the initial contact that they have with individuals that they might think are involved in criminal activities. They are involved in investigations. Sometimes those investigations are short, sometimes they're really long, and they have to make decisions about whether or not, you're going to, bring these people in to, those who you are in potentially engaging in criminal acts, like what you do. You have to use your discretion. And so, there's a lot of things that police do, and that in doing those things, police will come up with sort of a philosophy of policing. Police develop a work attitude, a work style that reflects their approach or their departmental approach to policing. Okay. So a lot of times, and you're going to see this in the podcast, I feel like I'm giving away too much here, but you're going to see that there are police styles that different police take, but there seems to be a broad police style that's trying to be communicated by the upper officers to the rest of the department, to the actual patrols. And so your textbook talks about these philosophies of policing. And so let's take a look at what some of the common police philosophies or police styles are. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the common police styles that those who are police officers, tend to incorporate into their jobs. So the police are a diverse group of people. They have very different backgrounds and different perspectives, and share different values at times. And like any workplace, people do their jobs in sort of different ways. And so police are a diverse group, and they embody different ways of doing their job. And even though you might have, sort of a preferred police style that is promoted by those in the top echelons of law enforcement within a department, you're still going to see that, different police officers have different personalities, and they take different approaches to their job. So what are some of the common ones? Well, one common police style is what your textbook calls the crime fighter. And so from this, if a police officer adopts this style, that basically they view themselves as that the main point of their job is to get the bad guys, right? That there are serious crimes that take place, and that basically that their job is to make sure that the evil people who are trying to harm the good and innocent people, that those people are investigated and captured and held accountable for what they're doing. And this is this approach is oftentimes referred to as the thin blue line approach, right? So cops who are, adopted the crime fighting police style, they basically see themselves as that blue line. Cops wear blue, right? The blue line between evildoers and good people, right? And that it's their job to make sure that those evil people don't break over and actually prey upon the innocent. And so if you're a crime fighter, that if that's your work style, I mean, you're gonna, really be focused a lot on fighting crime, particularly serious crime. Another approach, and this is almost a polar opposite, is when a police style is known as the social agent. And so from this perspective, from this style, these kinds of police officers believe that police should get involved in a wide range of activities within the community. And so that they're not necessarily just focusing on fighting crime, but the social agent, if you adopt that style, you see yourself more as a community problem solver. Sometimes the problem is violent crime, and you need to fight crime. But there are other problems that present themselves, particularly if you have like sort of a social fabric within a community that's fraying. You're going to see, like people maybe who, don't have jobs, or who are suffering from drug addiction, and then their behaviors play out in the community and basically cause problems. And so sometimes, when you take this approach, that the police officer might say, well, if you see a vagrant, a person who's, engaged in some sort of public order offense, drinking in public, sleeping in public, rather than hauling them down to the police station, they might make a connection to a social an agency, a social agency within the community that could provide them with shelter or provide them with some drug rehab. Okay. And so the social agent sort of sees their job as something not just crime fighting, but other addressing other problems within the community as well. Another style is the law enforcer. And so if you adopt this approach, that the law enforcement is sort of like does their job by the book, right? So it's sort of like these are the clearly defined rules that law enforcement should abide by, that these are the clearly defined laws that people should follow, and that when people violate those laws, then you should apply the law accordingly, right? And so the law enforcer is not sort of focusing on just the serious criminals or broadening out their approach to a whole host of social problems within the community, but basically sort of do their job by the book. And then finally, your textbook talks about the style as known as the watchman. And so if law enforcement embrace this policing style, that they see their job as the goal of their job is to maintain public order. And so while the law enforcer approach by the book may actually, just like any infraction is worthy of getting a ticket or any infraction is worthy of arrest and being brought down to the police station, the watchman is going to say, hey, look, what is really affecting public order and what is bringing about chaos and disorder? And that's what they are going to focus on. That, juveniles are going to act out. You don't have to by the book, drag them down to the police force office all the time. That there will be some, brawling maybe outside of a bar or something like that. But, the watchman is going to look the other way a lot of times on those sorts of activities and really just sort of focus on holding accountable those actions that are really disrupting public order. Okay, so let's take what we've learned about police style and apply it to the justice perspectives that we learned about earlier this semester. So you remember, crime control is a justice perspective, a rehabilitation, restorative justice, equal justice. Okay, so you're well versed in those at this point in the semester. So what I want us to do is I'm going to put the different police styles up there, and then I want you to pause the video, and I want you to just sort of think, okay, well, of these different police styles, what justice perspectives do they correspond to? And so as it says, their police styles correspond to criminal justice perspectives. So the crime fighter, which of the criminal justice perspectives does that seem to correspond to? The social agent, the law enforcer, the watchman. So pause the video, get out a piece of paper, and think about how these concepts interact with each other. Hey, welcome back. Okay. So the crime fighter, I think crime fighter, the thin blue line approach corresponds pretty closely with the crime control perspective. Remember the quote we had from Wilson earlier in the semester where they're sort of like, there's evil people and there's nothing you can do but to block them away. And then there's innocent people, and then there's the people in the middle, the vast majority are waiting and watching. Well, the crime fighter ascribes to this notion that there are evil people out there that need to be held accountable, right? And do what it takes to sort of hold those people accountable. So the crime fighter kind of fits well within the crime control perspective. What about the social agent? I would say that there's, the social agent probably falls into two categories. Definitely rehabilitationist, because as a social agent, you're sort of seeing that law enforcement isn't just about fighting crime, but it's about solving the social problems within a community and being embedded in your community. And so there you could see a rehabilitationist, but you could also sort of see restorative justice as well, because there's this idea that policing is connected to the community, maybe community policing, and that the better you know the community and you know the people that you are actually serving in your neighborhoods or on your police beat, then you can kind of hold them accountable in ways that solve the problem, but that don't necessarily lead to some sort of, being cited or being charged with a crime. So there's sort of a restorative justice feel to that as well. The idea that the point that there are problems and that those problems need to be repaired in order to make the society more whole. And so I could sort of see social agents relating to that. The law enforcer, right, by the book, see themselves as neither a crime fighter nor a social agent solving community problems. The law enforcer, is by the book, sees themselves as a professional and basically guided by those professional obligations. You could definitely see the law enforcer falling into the category of due process or equal justice as well, right? Because you're basically you're following the rules and you're applying the law equally and professionally, regardless of sort of personal bias. And also by the book, due process fits into that as well. I would say that the Watchman falls into non-interventionist to a certain degree, right? It's sort of like you don't have to bust everybody at every time, right? That there's some infractions that you just can look the other way on because they're not really disrupting public order, but you're going to crack down on those incidences that are disrupting public order. So I think that might fall into the non-interventionist perspective. Okay, so the last concept that we're going to talk about is police discretion. And earlier in the semester, we really talked about, since police are gateways into the criminal justice system, they have a lot of discretion. They can make decisions about initial contact and what and who they're going to investigate, that they do have a lot of discretion. And that's a good thing in a lot of ways, right? I mean, well, for one, we have limited law enforcement out there and law enforcement are expensive. So, in terms of, from a budgetary perspective, and our criminal justice system is overwhelmed. And so you want police to use discretion also because you don't want everybody who does something technically wrong to be brought into the criminal justice, process, because as we know, there can be some harm associated with that. And so police do use their discretion, and they should use their discretion. And so the police use personal decision making and choices in carrying out operations within the criminal justice system, and there's a benefit from that taking place. A good example of that here is, that selective enforcement of the law. That, as we know, that most police officers make on-the-ground decision or in the office decisions about what crimes they're going to investigate, where they're going to spend their resources, and who they are not going to investigate, and who's not going to be arrested. And so it's selective enforcement of the law, arrest some but not others. The amount of force used can be an example also of the discretion that law enforcement can use. Since police have a tremendous amount of power, how discretion is used is incredibly important. Particularly since there's not immediate oversight of the discretion that law enforcement use. Your textbook sort of talks about that when it comes to law enforcement and police discretion, that there are decisions that police make, but there's not a lot of accountability in terms of those decisions. They refer to it as low visibility decision making, right? Because a lot of those decisions are made without surveillance. The public aren't seeing it, or the broader public aren't seeing it. The commanding officers aren't seeing it, and so that discretion can be a beneficial thing. However, that if discretion is used in an arbitrary or a biased or racist sort of manner, I mean, obviously that there are going to be some problems with police discretion. And so, your textbook talks about exercising discretion. Discretion can be exercised in a way that is beneficial, but discretion can also reflect overt and implicit biases that law enforcement might have. And so I want to draw your attention to the concept summary that's in your textbook, the chart 7-1. And, it's a good summary of what your textbook says in terms of what are some of the factors that can influence police discretion. They talk about, that when it comes to crime factors, that the more serious the crime is, then there's usually less discretion that's going to be used. Minor crimes, more discretion. Serious crimes, that officers are likely to take action and use less discretion in terms of arresting people for and investigating serious crimes. Victim factors that your textbook talks about, that the relationship between victim and offender can influence discretion, the discretionary action of law enforcement. And so if the offender knows the victim, if it's a family dispute, if it's a dispute among friends, then you might, try to resolve that conflict in a way that doesn't involve arresting somebody. However, if the victim is unknown to the offender, is just sort of a random victim that is being chosen by the offender, probably less discretion that's going to be exercised there. That there can be department factors that impact discretion. And so we sort of see that as we're coming out of a time, or we're still in the thick of a time, about evaluating and reforming the use of force that police officers use. You basically see that you're reducing this discretion that police officers can exercise. A good example of that is the ruling that came down with the police officers who were just standing by and watching Derek Chauvin. They were found guilty of violating George Floyd's civil rights, and they could face stiff punishment for that. They haven't been sentenced yet. And so the takeaway from that is that you don't stand by and watch while your fellow officers are doing horrendous things. And you can bet your bottom dollar that is going to be reflected in police changing of police and departmental rules to protect police officers, but also to make sure that this kind of excessive use of force isn't going to be used. I won't go through the whole chart. I'll leave it to you. You can read more about that in the chapter, but I just wanted to draw your attention to that chart because it's a handy little concept summary that you can use as you are preparing for your quizzes and ultimately for your final exam. All right, thanks for listening, and I will talk to you again soon.